Last time I was here, there was also a TV crew, also a camera crew. It was a TV camera crew, and they were filming an episode of Impractical Jokers, the comedy program. And it involved this comedian having to stand up here before my talk and give an impromptu, totally improvised, utterly spoof lecture on memory. My talk was quite good in comparison. So I'm hoping the same hoping the same effect will happen tonight. It's very appropriate that we are starting with comedy because my story starts with Mel Gibson playing a character called Nick Marshall, an advertising executive who, after a freak accident involving a bathtub, a hairdryer, and copious quantities of red wine, comes to with an uncanny ability to read people's minds, to listen in to their thoughts. And the reason I mention this rather silly example of somebody dealing with other people's thoughts is that when Mel listens into people's thoughts, he really does overhear them. He hears what people are saying to themselves. Thinking in this depiction of it is a conversation. It is something that a person is saying to herself as she's going about her business. So in this clip here, Mel is listening in to what his boss, Darcy, is saying to herself in some particular situation at work. So the reason I mention it is to try to illustrate the fact that thinking, for many of us, is a verbal process. It involves language. It involves some kind of speech. And in fact, when you ask people to reflect on their own experience, this is very much what people say. Lots of people say there are words in the head. There's other stuff, of course, there as well. There is music, there are images, there's all sorts of things that make up what William James, at the end of the 19th century, memorably called the stream of consciousness. But verbal qualities seem to be particularly important, and many, many people will say that their thoughts have something of the linguistic about them. And you get this if you ask people more formally to reflect on their own experience, if you ask them to fill in questionnaires, and so on. So I'm interested in where this comes from. So I want to explore that phenomenon tonight. I want to ask, where do these words in the head come from? What are they doing there? And what are they like? I came to this topic as a developmental psychologist. I was interested initially as a psychologist in the development of children and babies, and I became particularly focused on one particular aspect of children's developing experience, how they come to use language in their thinking. So my interest as a developmental psychologist is in where does this language come from, what is it doing there, and what is it like, to use the technical term, what is its phenomenology? And for me, the most useful, the most powerful, the most profound views on this come from the Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky, who flourished in the 20s and 30s in the early Soviet Union. So I'm going to say a bit about Vygotsky's ideas, but I'm going to illustrate them first of all with the case of a small child. Those of you who came to my Royal Institution talk way back in 2010 will recognize my little unpaid research assistant. My daughter Athena, who here is about 2 1/4, she's now 16 and nearly 6 foot tall. She really doesn't mind. I still haven't paid her, but she doesn't mind me doing this. And what I'm going to do is show you a little clip of Athena playing with her toys. And I should say that her speech, like the speech of many toddlers, is rather indistinct. So what I've done is I've translated it for you, so I've sort of spelt out what she's saying, just in case you can't make it out. Okay, I just want to ask a simple question. Who is Athena talking to? Any suggestions? I'm hearing quite a lot of herself. And I agree. Okay, I think you get a really strong impression from watching this that Athena is engaged in a private monologue, dialogue. She's talking to herself. Not all the way through. So right at the beginning, she says, I'm going to make a train track, or I didn't put the daddy up there, but right at the beginning, she does mention my name. She says, I'm going to make a train track, daddy. And when we're coding children's language in this way, we would count that as social speech because it uses my name. It's addressed to me. But that's right at the beginning. And then for the rest of the clip, I could have got on a spaceship and flown to Mars for all she cared. It wouldn't have made any difference to her. She was talking to herself. It's a curious finding that children do more of this kind of speech. She's completely normal, by the way. This is what children do. Children between the ages of 2 and 8, roughly, do this all the time. And if you've got access to a small child and a chance to listen to them playing, you'll hear this kind of thing going on. Okay, so she's completely normal. And it seems to be a completely typical aspect of children's experience, that they talk to themselves whilst they're playing. They seem to do more of it when there are other people around, but they're nevertheless focusing the words on themselves. And this is where Vygotsky comes in, because Vygotsky had a lovely, clear, simple theory of how all this works. He argues that children are born into a social world. They don't have to become social. They don't have to learn to be social. They are born social. They're engaging with other people from the very first days of life. As language develops, that becomes a linguistic process of communication. So they're engaged in social dialogue from almost as soon as they've got language. And then they go through a stage of what Vygotsky called internalization, when that conversation that the child is having with another person becomes taken on into the self. And she starts to do it for herself. She conducts the entire dialogue for herself. But she's still doing it out loud. This is the stage known as private speech, and you just saw an illustration of private speech in that clip from Athena. So it's talking to yourself out loud, but talking to yourself. Then according to Vygotsky, there's a bit more internalization, and all that stuff that was going on externally becomes totally internalized, so it's just going on in the head. And that is your inner speech. That is the words in your head that you hear when you're walking to work, when you're lying in the bath, when you're preparing dinner in the kitchen. That internal conversation started out developmentally as an external conversation. So it's a pretty simple idea. It's slightly more complicated than that because Vygotsky thought that as language is internalized, it changes. And in particular, it becomes abbreviated, it becomes shortened. So for example, Athena says to herself, I need some cars. And she answers herself, 2 cars. She doesn't say, I need 2 cars. I need 2 cars for my train track. She says, 2 cars. So the sentence, the utterance is squashed up, compressed, condensed. It's like a telegraphic form of what might be said in an external conversation. Note also something interesting about Athena's language in that little extract. I need some cars, 2 cars. She's talking to herself in the form of a dialogue. She's saying to herself, at one point she says, what am I doing? I'm going to build a train track. She's asking herself a question and then answering it. So she's doing that whole dialogue for herself that initially, according to Vygotsky, would have been done between 2 people, then becomes conducted out loud for the self, and then ultimately is done entirely internally, entirely silently. That is your inner speech. Now, I found this as a PhD student in the 1990s a profoundly interesting idea, and I thought it suggested all sorts of lines of research that I couldn't see being explored. A couple of the things that I focused on are the implication that our inner speech should have a dialogic quality. When we talk to ourselves, it should be like a dialogue, and as we'll see, that's pretty important for what follows. Another implication is that there should be different kinds of inner speech. Remember what I said about these processes of transformation, of abbreviation, that happen when speech is internalized? Well, that should mean that our inner speech takes different forms. And I focused in particular on two kinds, one that I call expanded inner speech and one that I call condensed inner speech. Expanded inner speech is when you're having a conversation with yourself and it really is a full-blown conversation. You're saying a full sentence to yourself and then you're answering it in a full sentence and the words are fully expanded and stretched out. Condensed inner speech is probably more like what we're doing most of the time. Condensed inner speech is that note form version. It's the two cars. It's the stripped down, abbreviated version of inner speech. And the implication that I'm interested in is that we should be able to move, but we should be able to do all these different kinds of inner speech and move between them as not just as we grow up, but as adults as well. So another show of hands. Hands up if you ever talk to yourself out loud. Okay, thank you. Thank you for being honest. It's a wonderful, honest audience here, as ever. Lots of people think it's a bit weird to admit that you talk to yourself out loud. I do it the whole time, and I don't see why people have a hang-up about it. And in fact, it's exactly what you'd predict from Vygotsky's theory. This is my modification of that diagram I showed you earlier. So remember we had this diagram a couple of slides ago, and I've just flipped it around. So we start off at the bottom with social speech, we move up to private speech, and then we've got two kinds of inner speech. We've got the expanded form, where you're really having a conversation with yourself and you're putting a point of view forward and then you're answering it and you're saying all the objections to it and then you're putting a counterpunch in and so on. You're really going to town. You're really having that full-blown internal conversation. That's your expanded inner speech. And then you've got your condensed inner speech, which is much more stripped down, telegraphic. It's like you're sending telegrams to yourself. It's like you're thinking to yourself in note form. You can move between all these levels. You don't just have one or the other. You're moving between all these levels all the time, including moving from inner speech back to private speech. Adults do it as well. Vygotsky seemed to think that out-loud private speech goes away as children develop, but it doesn't. Adults do it the whole time. Okay, that's the basic sort of structure of my modification of Vygotsky's scheme, and as we'll see, that suggests all sorts of interesting research ideas, which I'll touch on in what's to come. A more important question, before we go any further, though, is how the hell? Inner speech is by definition private. Inner speech is something that only you know about. If you were Mel Gibson, you could peer into the mind of the person next to you, but we're not Mel Gibson. What I didn't mention, of course, was the really dodgy thing about this movie, which is that Mel can read people's minds, but he can only read women's minds. So he can work out what women are thinking, which is, of course, extremely important in his life. So it was pointed out to me that a much more politically sound example of somebody doing this kind of thing is Suki Stackhouse from True Blood. Suki also listens into people's thoughts. She's telepathic. She can hear what people are thinking. And when she does, she hears people speaking. Thinking is a kind of speaking. So I'm neither Mel nor Suki. I've got to use more mortal kind of ways of studying this stuff. There are things I can do. I can look at individual differences. So I can look at differences in the extent to which one person uses inner speech compared to another, and I can see whether that correlates with their performance on psychological tests. I can do what psychologists call a dual task paradigm. And that simply means if you think that using inner speech is important for a particular task, then make the person do that task while at the same time trying to knock out their inner speech. Stopping them from using language, making them do the task. If inner speech is important for that task, then stopping them using inner speech should mess up their performance. So you give them two tasks at the same time. One is the task that you're interested in. One is designed to knock out your ability to do it, to use any language, including inner speech. And that's a pretty useful way of studying this stuff. We can do phenomenological studies, and here I've got in mind simply asking people, giving them a questionnaire and saying, do you do a lot of inner speech? What's your inner speech like? We can do that, that's fine. We can do more in-depth experience sampling, and I'm going to give you an example of that in a second. And we can look at the brain. So There are various things we can do. I'm going to show you some fMRI data in a second. We can also use neurostimulation, artificially changing the activity of the brain for brief periods of time to see what effect it has on people's performance on tasks. And we can look at neuropsychology. This has been around for well over 100 years, the idea that studying naturally occurring brain damage can tell you something about what parts of the brain are involved. So, as that PhD student in the 1990s, people were looking at me and shaking their heads and saying, no, you can't study inner speech. But actually, things have changed a lot. So when new scientists asked me to review this a couple of years ago for this cover feature, there was plenty to talk about. There was plenty of research out there. And my colleague Ben Alderson-Day and I reviewed the literature just last year for Psychological Bulletin, and there's something like 250 references in that paper. There's a lot of published research that we could point to that was relevant to this issue. So, plenty of examples of this kind of research coming up. I'll start with one example of what I call phenomenological studies, and here we're simply using a smartphone app. So this thing called Inner Life we designed. You open it up, you choose a time period in which you want to be alerted, a slot within your day when you feel you want to answer these questions. And then when the alert goes off, the phone beeps or whatever, you get some questions to answer. So you get a quick little questionnaire about what your thinking was like at that particular moment. And we found some quite interesting results. Using this app with a sample of students, we found that it kind of correlated with what people were saying in ordinary questionnaires, and we think it's a useful way of studying this stuff going forward. One problem, though, is that asking people about their inner experience is problematic. And the reason for that is that people tend to have very strong preconceptions about their experience. If I asked you individually now whether you talk to yourself, quite a few of you would probably say, yes, I'm doing it all the time. I never stop talking to myself. And that's fine. It's a very strong impression that people have, but it's probably false. I used to think that I talk to myself all the time, but I don't now. I think I probably talk to myself quite a lot, and when I do, it's very salient, it's very noticeable. But I think a lot of the time I'm not actually doing it. I'll give you some reasons for that in a second. But it makes us worry about questionnaires, it makes us worry about apps, because we think all you're really doing if you're asking people what their inner experience is like is you're asking about their preconceptions. What do you think your inner experience is like, rather than what is it actually like? So we've been using a method, a kind of experience sampling known as descriptive experience sampling, which I'll describe to you now. It has been developed over a period of 40 years or so by the psychologist Russell Hurlburt at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And it involves some rather low-tech equipment. It involves this thing, the thing he calls a beeper, which clips to your belt, very much like this microphone thing that I'm wearing. And it has an earpiece that goes into your ear, a bit like this thing I've got on my head. And you wear this thing for a few hours in a particular day, and every so often, randomly, the thing will beep. A beep will sound in your ear. And then you've got an important task to do. What you have to do at that moment is think about what was going on just before the beep beeped. And you have to make quick notes for yourself about what you were thinking about, what was in your experience. And then the next day you come into the lab and we grill you on those moments of experience. So we sit down for an hour or so and we take you through each of the 6 or so beeps you might have collected the day before. We can spend 20 minutes, half an hour talking about one tiny moment of experience. It's completely fascinating. It's very hard to do for the participants. And the crucial thing is you're no good at it when you start. You have to keep doing it. You have to do it over a few days so that you can get better at it. And it's fascinating to see how people's ability to do this thing changes over the course of a few days. So it's not something that you just come in and do as a one-off thing. It's something that you have to learn to do over the course of a few days. And that's crucial for what I'm about to describe to you, which is a study that we did in Berlin at the Max Planck Institute. What we wanted to do is, for the first time ever, combine this very detailed method of getting at people's inner experience with the power of neuroimaging. And in order to do that, we had to have quite a complicated study design. This is that study design. All I want you to take from this slide is, wow, it's complicated. No, actually, I want you to take slightly more from that. This is how people moved through the study. They started here. They did a week's worth of work with us, came back, did a second week's worth of work, and finished here. The first week, they were doing beeping. They were wearing the beeper. They were going about their everyday lives. They were riding the U-Bahn. They were going to college. They were going to work. They were doing whatever they do in Berlin. And they were wearing this thing. Every so often it was beeping, and they were taking notes, and they were coming into the lab, and we were talking about we were training them up in doing this method. Okay, so by the end of it, they were crack experience samplers. They really knew what they were doing. They were very good at it. Then we did it all over again. But this time we did it in the MRI scanner. So we were asking them to wear the beeper, to listen to the beep, to take notes. We rigged it up so that they could be lying in the scanner and their right hand was free or their writing hand was free, and they could write notes to themselves. We'd give them 25 minutes in the scanner. We'd take them out of the scanner, take them across the corridor. We'd sit them down and we'd interview them about the beeps they'd had in the scanner. Then we'd stick them back into the scanner to cook for another 25 minutes. And they did that day after day. They did that for like 4 or 5 days. By the end of it, we'd gathered a huge amount of neuroimaging data. We knew what the brain was doing through all of this time, and we knew what the brain was doing at the moment that the beeps went off. And the other main thing I want you to take from this diagram is this bit here. It reads, task-elicited experience. What people have always done when they've studied inner speech in the scanner is they put people in the brain scanner and they've said, right, now do some inner speech. So they might give them a sentence to say to themselves silently. They give them a cue. They say, right, do that bit of inner speech right now. They scan their brains and they find certain things happen and they say, right, now we understand what's going on in the brain when people do inner speech, when people talk to themselves. We wanted to do that, and we wanted to compare it with what happens when people do inner speech naturally. When people talk to themselves, not because they've been told to do it by an experimenter, but because they just naturally happen spontaneously to want to do some inner speech at that moment. And because we collected all these beeps in the scanner, we were able to look at all these beeps and say, right, where's some inner speech? Where is the inner speech happening? Where are people talking to themselves? And then we could compare the activations when people were doing inner speech because they had to, because we told them to, with when they were doing it because they naturally, spontaneously were doing it. And this is what I'm going to show you now. We focused on 2 particular parts of the brain. We focused on this area called, colloquially known as Broca's area. It's sort of here in the brain. It's the left inferior frontal gyrus. And it's very, very strongly implicated in language production. If you have damage to this area, you're going to have aphasia. You're going to have a problem in producing language. And it always lights up. When people do inner speech studies in the scanner, this part of the brain always lights up. We looked at a second area, which is known as Heschel's gyrus, and we picked this area because it's not meant to be involved in speech production. It's meant to be involved in hearing stuff, in processing speech and other sounds. It wasn't meant to be a big speech production area, so we didn't expect it to activate when people were doing inner speech. And indeed, all those studies that have been done previously find that it doesn't activate. So I'm going to show you the activations that we had, first of all, in the elicited conditions. So remember, this is where we're asking people to do inner speech, and they're doing it because we told them to. And what you find is exactly as you predict. When people are doing inner speech because they're told to, Broca's area lights up, and this area is not doing anything. It's deactivating. So it's exactly the pattern that you find from all these other studies that have been done. But then remember, we were able to look at the cases when people were naturally, spontaneously producing this stuff, when they were thinking because they wanted to. They were thinking naturally and spontaneously. And we found the opposite pattern of findings. Don't worry about the red bars. We're just looking at the blue bars for now. So this is the spontaneous inner speech. When people are doing inner speech naturally, there's nothing in Broca. There's no activation, or tiny amount. But there's a huge activation in this part of the brain which isn't supposed to be involved in speech. You get completely the opposite pattern of findings depending on whether you ask people to do in a speech compared to when they do it naturally and spontaneously. And we think the implications of this are pretty profound, not least for all the studies that have gone about thinking that you can study this stuff simply by telling people to do it. So I'm going to change tack slightly now, and I'm going to talk about an experience that, having spoken about something that I think most people in this room will relate to, I'm going to talk about an experience that many people probably wouldn't admit to, probably wouldn't relate to. I'm going to talk about the experience of hearing voices. Hearing voices when there is no one there. Hearing voices in the absence of any speaker. Usually associated with severe mental illness, a diagnosis such as schizophrenia. Indeed, if you have a diagnosis of schizophrenia, around about 70% of people with that diagnosis will hear voices. In medical terms, it's known as auditory verbal hallucinations. And it's often assumed that hearing voices just is schizophrenia. The two things are the same, that nothing could be further from the truth. Many, many other psychiatric disorders have voice hearing associated with them. So people hear voices in eating disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, bipolar disorder. The list goes on and on. There is also a significant number of people who hear voices pretty regularly, and they do not meet the criteria for mental illness because they're not mentally ill. They hear voices, they have this experience, but it doesn't bother them, it doesn't distress them, it doesn't mess up their lives. They don't seek psychiatric help, they don't get a psychiatric diagnosis, and quite right too. We think roughly 1% of people are in that bracket. About as many people who have schizophrenia. So there's a lot of people who hear voices who are not mentally ill, and then there's a much larger group of people, somewhere between 5 to 15% of the population, who will have fleeting, one-off, or very uncommon voice hearing experiences. You can go even further, and you can say that if we're encompassing experiences that happen on the verges of sleep, at the moment of falling asleep or at the moment of waking up, the proportion of people who have hallucinatory experiences there rises to about 80% in our studies. So most people have hallucinations in that state. So voice hearing happens to a whole lot of different people. It seems to be an aspect of human experience that is not indicative of mental illness necessarily. It can be understood in all sorts of different ways, and in fact it has been understood in very different ways, particularly in the last 25 years or so with the growth of the international hearing voices movement. People used to think that hearing voices just meant a severe mental illness like schizophrenia. They don't anymore, and people who hear voices get together, they meet, they talk about their experiences in groups, they support each other, they understand the resonances across the centuries and across cultures and so on, and they've become an incredibly powerful force in the mental health world. Things are changing in terms of the awful stigma that's associated with hearing voices. Not changing fast enough. A recent study in America showed that around about 50% of news reports about hearing voices associated it with violence, which is a terribly skewed, distorted view of this experience. And in our project, Hearing the Voice at Durham, one of the things that we're trying to do is change public perceptions, help people to understand that hearing voices is a natural part of human experience. But why am I even talking about hearing voices? Surely I'm talking about something that's very deviant, that's very unusual, that's very strange, that's very not part of everyone's experience. Well, it actually seems to have a lot in common with the thing I've been talking about up to now, the experience of inner speech. And in particular, there's quite a neat theory that accounts for hearing voices, or tries to account for hearing voices, in terms of inner speech. And there's all sorts of psychological evidence from psychological tests, and there's neuroscientific evidence as well. So when you look at what's happening in the brain, there's evidence to support this model. The theory is very simple. People who hear voices, according to the theory, hear a voice when they're actually just producing some inner speech. They are just talking to themselves, but for some reason, they don't recognize it as something that they themselves have done. So you might hear a voice saying, "Go and get the milk," and it seems to be coming from over here, and it's strange and it's frightening and all the rest of it. According to this theory, all that's really happening there is you're thinking in inner speech, "Go and get the milk," but you're not recognizing it as your own utterance. For some reason, you don't see it as your own work. And this has quite a nice foundation in the brain. Remember I talked about this part at the front of the brain on the left, Broca's area, or the left inferior frontal gyrus, which we know is important in inner speech generation. And there are some parts of the brain further back. One's an area known as Wernicke's area, which is extremely important in speech perception. And the idea, totally simplifying here, by the way, but the basic idea is that what normally happens is that when you produce some inner speech, you're thinking to yourself, "Go and get the milk," it's almost like a signal is sent within your brain from that speech generation part of the brain to the speech perception area saying, "Don't worry too much about this thing you're about to hear because you said it." That's effectively the idea. The system, the auditory system is suppressed because it's getting a signal saying, "It was you that did that." So don't treat it as if it were an external utterance. Don't process it in that way. Just switch off. Don't worry about it. And that seems to be what happens in the typical case. So when we're talking to ourselves, usually, that message is getting through and we're not perceiving our inner speech as external. But for some reason, the theory goes, when people hear voices, that signal doesn't get through. It's degraded, it's delayed, it doesn't happen at all. Something goes wrong with that signal. And so the message saying, "Don't listen to this, it's just you," doesn't get through. And so people produce some inner speech, and they perceive it, they experience it as an external voice. So I'm simplifying hugely here. There is a lot of support for this view. It's a pretty good theory. It's had a lot of support from lots of different areas. There's lots wrong with it. We'll come to some ways in which it's problematic in a second. But first, I just want to suggest that there's no better way of tackling a topic that is at the cutting edge of neuroscientific research than stepping back 600 years in time and looking at a medieval manuscript. Let's have another show of hands. Who's heard of Marjorie Kemp? I'm not going to pick on volunteers. There's a few hands gone up. Great, thank you. I think many more people should have heard of Marjorie Kemp, not least because she was an extraordinary larger-than-life character. She lived at the end of the 14th and the beginning of the 15th century. She was based in the town of Lynn in Norfolk, now known as King's Lynn. She was married to John and had borne him 14 children. She'd failed in business twice, and she heard voices, and she saw things, and she had mystical experiences which she wrote about in her famous book. She believed she was hearing the voice of God and of other biblical characters, of other characters from Scripture, and she wrote about them in this extraordinary book. She herself couldn't write, so she dictated it to a scribe. And this is the book of Marjorie Kemp. This is it. There is one of them. This is the manuscript. And this is a photograph I took of the book when I went to visit it at the British Library, of which more later. It is unique. This is the book of Marjorie Kemp. It was written down in about 1440. And the reason more of you should know about Marjorie Kemp is that this book is also the first autobiography in the English language. Nobody, man or woman, had ever written about their life before in English. So Marjorie Kemp should be she is a literary colossus, but she should be known more widely as such. Why am I interested in her? Well, for all sorts of reasons, not least because she writes about her voice hearing. She writes about her experiences of hearing voices. And she shows us that this experience is a very diverse one. It comes in all sorts of shapes and sizes. And I'm going to give you a few little examples with the Middle English and a little modern English translation for you. Sometimes she hears a voice that is clear external speech. So in this, one of her earliest experiences, she hears Jesus speaking to her, saying, "Daughter, why have you forsaken me when I never forsook you?" Sometimes she hears something that is auditory but non-verbal. So she hears a sound, but it's not words. So in this case, she's hearing the voice of the sound of the Holy Ghost as if it had been a pair of bellows blowing in her ear. Okay, so the sound that the communication, the things she's hearing sounds like a pair of bellows for pumping up a fire. Sometimes she hears a voice that is auditory, but not even human. And then our Lord turned that sound into the voice of a dove. So she hears the voice of God, but it's the voice of a dove. In another bit later on in the same passage, she talks about it being turned into the voice of a robin redbreast. She also has experiences that are multisensory. She doesn't just hear Jesus in that first example. She sees him clad in a mantle of purple silk, sitting on her bedside. And we've argued that these experiences resonate very neatly with the experiences of voice hearers today. When you ask people, as we did in this survey published last year in the Lancet Psychiatry, when you ask people who hear voices what their experience is like, they give you this incredible range of phenomena. They tell you about things that are clear external speech and other things that are much more obscure and hard to pin down. They talk about other bodily sensations. So about 2/3 of the people who wrote in response to our survey said they had certain bodily feelings that went with their voice hearing, like a feeling of prickling or burning on the skin, for example. Lots of people said their voices were often a mixture between voices and thoughts. So it's not the case that voices are always these really clear, externally located experiences. They're highly diverse. And thinking about Marjorie Kemp and working in this interdisciplinary project, Hearing the Voice at Durham, which is supported by Wellcome, has brought me into contact with people who are studying this phenomenon from very different perspectives, such as the medieval scholar Corinne Saunders. And working with Corinne on Marjorie Kemp's writings has made me think differently about my science. It's made me think differently about how I approach inner speech. And I want to try and flesh a bit of that out, tell you some of the research that we've done that fits with that. And in particular, I want to focus on this idea of an inner dialogue. You're talking silently in your head, but you're talking to yourself. It's a to and fro. It's a give and take. It's two sides. It's a dialogue. And I was thinking about how does that work psychologically? It doesn't fit with any of the previous theories of inner speech, because nobody had ever thought about inner speech as a dialogue before. They'd always thought of it as a monologue. So I started to think, how can we construct a theory that makes sense of that? So I thought, well, what you've got to have in a dialogue is you've got to have me speaking. You've got to have some way of representing what I'm saying. This is the process of inner speech generation. But then you've also got to represent that other point of view, that other perspective in the dialogue with which I'm having a to and fro. So let's call it the me as interlocutor, or the person that I'm speaking to. And this is the sort of basic psychological structure of the dialogue. Crucially, that me as interlocutor is occupying what I call the open slot. I can have a conversation with myself, but I can have a conversation with other people as well. I can have an internal conversation with my mum, for example. My dear sister Claire is here in the audience as well, and I thought about including some photos of her from the 1980s. I think she'll thank me later for not doing so. So I can talk to my mum or my sister in my head quite happily. If I'm Marjorie, I can talk to God in my head. I can have an internal conversation with anyone because of that dialogic structure that has been established through the process of how I developed as a child. Because I was having conversations with other people that I was then internalizing, I've got this internal dialogic structure that enables me to have conversations internally with all sorts of other individuals. One person told me recently that she has a very frequent internal dialogues with other people, but people who are no longer with us. She has conversations with dead people who she knows, people who have passed away from her life. To me, that makes perfect sense. That's what inner dialogue is for. You can talk to yourself, but you can talk to other people, and you can talk to God and the angels and whoever you want to talk to. Back to the book of Marjorie Kemp. I mentioned that Marjorie lived in Lynn, or King's Lynn, in Norfolk. And if you turn to this page of Marjorie's book, you see this interesting reference in the margin, which says, Dame Julian. And this is a reference to Julian of Norwich. Hands up if you've heard of Julian of Norwich. Thank you. Slightly more people have heard of Julian of Norwich than Marjorie. She should also be more famous than she is, because Julian wrote a book called Revelations of Divine Love. She's got a man's name. It's a bit weird, isn't it? She's called Julian because she was an anchorite. In other words, she was a nun, a holy person who lived in a cell attached to a church. And the church she was attached to was St. Julian's Church in Norwich. So she's known as Julian of Norwich. We don't actually know what her name was, what her real name was. But she's known as Julian of Norwich. So despite the bloke's name, she's very much a she. And she wrote the first book in English known to have been written by a woman. She was the first female writer in English, which is a pretty massive claim to fame. And she's unjustly neglected. The reason I'm interested in Julian is because she also heard voices and saw things and had unusual experiences. And this reference in Marjorie's book is where Marjorie is hearing a voice instructing her to go to Norwich and to seek out Julian and to talk to her about her experiences, because Julian has wisdom in these matters, and Julian will help you to understand if the voices you are hearing are the true voice of God. So that's what this passage in Marjorie's book is saying. Go to Norwich, talk to this Julian woman. So the two women met. They met almost exactly 600 years ago, we think, around about the year 1415 in Norwich. They spent a few days together, according to Marjorie, and they talked about their voices. I like to think of it as an early hearing voices group. Julian was a very, very different character, utterly fascinating, brilliant writer, great theologian. She also heard voices, and she also had very diverse experiences. So in this example, she's hearing the voice, she's just had a vision of the devil. And she's saying, I heard a bodily jangling, a kind of commotion, as if it had been of two bodies, and both, to my thinking, were jangling at the same time, as if they'd been holding a parliament or a meeting with a great business. And all was soft muttering, and as I understood nothing of what they said. And all this was to stir me to despair. So she's describing an experience which is quite common for people who hear voices, that of overhearing an obscured conversation, a conversation that you can only hear indistinctly. So you know some people are talking, but you can't work out what they're saying. And it can be quite distressing. It can be quite anxiety-provoking. And this is Julian writing about it 600 years ago. So as part of the work that I've been doing with Hearing the Voice, part of the work I've been doing with Welcome, an opportunity arose to do something, to indulge this fascination with these two incredibly important women writers. And as Welcome were planning their latest exhibition, This Is a Voice, which is on now and will run until the end of July, they wanted to include something on hearing voices, so I helped them to put their exhibit together. And I was very keen, in particular, that we should at least have a go at getting the manuscripts. Remember, there is only one version of Marjorie's manuscript. It's held in the British Library. There are a few versions of Julian's manuscript, but they're also utterly unique. And we thought we'd have a go at borrowing them. And thankfully, we were able to persuade them that around these two manuscripts, we could create a really powerful exhibit. And that's what we did. We secured the loan. Didn't realize it at the time, but it was the first time the two manuscripts had ever been displayed together, which I think is amazing, that given that these two women met, the two manuscripts hadn't been shown together ever. And this is how it was covered in The Guardian a few weeks ago. And if you go to the exhibition, which is a Wellcome collection on opposite Euston, it's a free exhibition, you will see these two manuscripts. You will see the book of Marjorie Kemp. It's not usually on display at the British Library, but it's on display now. This is what you'll see. On the left is Marjorie's book. You'll see the page of Marjorie. This is exactly the page of Marjorie's book that you'll see when you go to the exhibition. And on the right is Julian's book. Julian's book in a later edition. It's probably copied around 1625. There is an earlier version of Julian, but we couldn't secure a loan of that because the British Library didn't want to leave two utterly priceless, they're obviously priceless, but utterly unique manuscripts out of the building at the same time. So we had one of the slightly later versions of Julian. When you see the Marjorie's book, it's quite small, it's quite hard to read, unless you're a medieval English scholar, so I'm going to help you out a bit here. You see this page on the left. Have you noticed, by the way, the love heart in the margin? The monks who looked after this book after it was written down were big fans of marginalia, as we've already seen. And I like to think that this monk was indicating that he really liked this passage. I really like it. I'm going to zoom in on it. It's kind of up here. I'm zooming in, and you can see the original text of the bits that I've just mentioned to you, as if it had been a pair of bellows blowing in her ear. And then later on, she talks about the voice of a dove, and then a little bird that is called a redbreast at the bottom there. So that's the page that you will see of Marjorie's text. If we look at Julian's text now, this is a famous passage where Julian has had an experience, it's her first revelation, in fact, and she's looking down at the palm of her own hand, and she sees a tiny little thing about the size of a hazelnut in her hand, and she thinks to herself, in a speech, she says to herself, what could it be? And she hears a voice saying, it is all that is made. So she hears the voice of God saying, that little thing you see in your hand, about the size of a hazelnut, is the entirety of my creation. It is everything that I made. And this script is much, much clearer. And in this she showed me a little thing, the quantity, in other words, the size of a hazelnut, lying in the palm of my hand. And then she says, what may this be? And it was answered generally thus, it is all that is made. So that's the bit that you'll see of Julian's text in the Wellcome exhibition. So we thought by putting these two texts together, the incredibly rich description of hearing voices that they give us, the way they resonate across the centuries, even better would be if we could get some young people who hear voices to make something to go into the exhibition. And so an artist worked with a group of young people who hear voices, and they created this artwork. It's called Everyday Objects Belonging to a Voice Hearer. And on one side of the panel, you can see the everyday objects belonging to a voice hearer. On the other, you can see everyday objects belonging to a non-voice hearer. And the point is, I don't know how clearly you can see it, but if you look at it, in the flesh, as it were, in the exhibition, you'll see there's no difference. You can't tell which belongs to the voice hearer and which belongs to the non-voice hearer, and that's the whole point. So do go along and have a look at the exhibition if you can. I think it's a really powerful and hopefully quite well balanced account of hearing voices. I'm going to go back to a little bit of science to finish off. And I want to zoom in again on this issue of internal dialogue. This is a pretty scary diagram from that article that I mentioned that Ben Alderson-Day and I published last year, which was our big review on inner speech. And all this is doing really is showing that a particular part of the cognitive system, this thing here, if any of you studied psychology, you'll know about working memory, the working memory system. And the working memory system is the bit of the mind that allows us to rehearse information, keep information in mind. If you think about how if you're walking around the supermarket and you're reciting to yourself the last few items on your shopping list, you're using working memory. You're talking to yourself for a particular purpose to keep things in memory. And that's all that scary bit there is. And then there's this scary bit up here, which is really just showing you the aspect that I've already mentioned of how you have to keep another person's perspective in mind. And this is called theory of mind or social cognition. You may well have come across these terms. Theory of mind is your ability to think about the minds of others. And we argued that to do internal dialogue, because you've got to represent these different points of view, you must be doing some theory of mind. So we're interested in how the language system interacts with the theory of mind system. So it's really the same diagram as I showed you earlier on, but just with a bit more psychological flesh on it. And we thought, well, if it's true that some inner speech is dialogic, has a quality of a dialogue, if it's recruiting theory of mind, if it's using bits of the brain that do theory of mind, we should see that happening in the scanner. So we did the first study that tried to get people doing inner speech that was more like the kind of inner speech that I think we do spontaneously. In other words, a dialogue, an internal dialogue. So we asked people to go into the scanner. This is in the university scanner in Middlesbrough. And in the scanner, they were asked to generate some inner speech, and in two conditions. They were either doing it in a condition of a monologue, or they were doing it as a dialogue. And they were given a scenario. So they were asked to imagine going back to their old school and conducting an inner speech, either a monologue, giving a speech to the students, or a dialogue, having a conversation with an old head teacher. And we had a sequence of these scenarios. And we looked at what was going on in the brain when people were doing this stuff. And here are some blobs for you. We were able to work out what was special about the dialogic inner speech by comparing the activations when people were doing dialogic inner speech and subtracting away the activations when people were doing monologic inner speech. So the blue bits here represent the dialogic over monologic comparison. In other words, it's what's going on that's special in the brain when you're doing dialogue. The yellow bits represent your theory of mind system. So we got people doing theory of mind tasks and scanned them as they were thinking about other people's minds. The crucial thing, the thing we were really interested in, was, is there a conjunction? Are there any bits of the brain that are activated in both? And that's the kind of thing that neuroscientists get excited about when you see an overlap between regions. And we thought we had found such an overlap in the right hemisphere in an area roughly around the temporoparietal junction, which is quite a big area from lots of previous studies in the theory of mind. So we were quite excited about this because we thought we've got an interaction between a language system and a theory of mind system, just as we'd predicted. This is how it's illustrated in my book in a lovely diagram prepared by Mary Robson, who did all the diagrams in the book. This is our left hemisphere language system, is our inner speech network, and this is our right hemisphere theory of mind system. And the idea, we argue that our findings support an interaction, a kind of conversation between these two different parts of the brain, one involved in language, one involved in thinking about other minds. If you put the two things together, you've got inner dialogue. Some other research that we've been doing recently suggests that more general aspects of brain development might play a role. So we had access to a sample of brain scans from some patients with schizophrenia in Australia. And Jane Garrison, who led the study at Cambridge, had developed expertise in being able to measure a particular part of the brain known as the paracingulate sulcus. And it's a little fold that's kind of deep down inside your brain towards the front. And the interesting thing about the PCS is that it varies in length. Here's a picture of somebody with a long PCS. Can you see? It's the red thing here. And here's a picture of somebody with a short PCS. I mean, you won't all have a PCS. Most of you will have one. And it will vary in length hugely between you. And some previous research that the team at Cambridge had been doing suggested that this particular fold in the brain correlated with how good people were at distinguishing between stuff that happened internally, things that they'd imagined, versus things that happened externally. And so we predicted that this might play a role in whether people were likely to hallucinate. The idea is that if you hallucinate, what's going on is that you're producing something internally, like some inner speech, but you're not recognizing it as your own, so you're mistaking it for something that happened externally. That's why we were interested in this part of the brain. And we found quite a neat correlation. We found there's no difference, actually, between healthy control subjects without a diagnosis and the schizophrenia patients who didn't hallucinate. So we had information on whether the patients had hallucinations or not. Healthy controls were no different. I mean, there's a slight difference, but it's not statistically significant. Healthy controls were no different to schizophrenia patients who didn't hallucinate in the length of this fold. But they were significantly different to the schizophrenia patients who did hallucinate. So among people with schizophrenia, the length of this fold predicted how likely they were to have hallucinations. And we found that for every 1 centimeter that this particular fold was reduced in length, these patients' likelihood of having hallucinations increased by 20%. This work was covered by Jonathan, in fact, for BBC News. And he did a really good job of it. We were really delighted with the way he covered it, and not least because most of the other reports on this would have said something like frontal brain wrinkle linked to schizophrenia. And of course, that isn't what we showed. This wasn't about saying this is what a schizophrenic brain looks like. It was about saying among a bunch of people with schizophrenia, there is this interesting difference. So we linked it to hallucinations, not to schizophrenia. Okay, I'm just going to end with a few outstanding questions for research, some of the things that we're interested in going forward, some of the things where I think the important breakthroughs will happen in the future. So one interesting issue is about the extent to which voices are communicative. This is a picture of Jo Atkinson, who's a psychologist at UCL, who focuses on deaf cognition. So she herself has been deaf since childhood, and she's done some amazing work on people who are deaf, including deaf people who hear voices. And you might think this is completely paradoxical. It does sound a bit strange that somebody who, in some cases, people who have never heard anything, who have always been deaf, will hear voices. But they do. And if you ask them, they produce exactly the right, appropriate signs for hearing voices. You say to them, you can't be hearing voices, you're deaf. They say, I'm hearing voices. So Jo's work is profoundly important to us, and we're collaborating with her because we're interested in something it tells us about this experience of hearing voices. It's not about an auditory phenomenon. It's not about sound. It's about something else. And in particular, we think hearing voices is about, at least some of them, at least part of the experience, is about sensing that someone is trying to communicate with you. So we're working with Jo on that topic. More generally, we're interested in the social quality of voices and the extent to which theory can account for the fact that voices involve a kind of social interaction. A lot of voices don't seem to fit with the inner speech model, so someone like Eleanor Longden, who we collaborate with in her very popular TED talk, has written about the role of trauma in hearing voices. And so we think there are different kinds of voice hearing experience, and they need to be understood differently. We need to know how these experiences develop. And we need to unpack the implications for therapy. If there are these different kinds of voices that have different underpinnings, what does that mean for the way that we try and deal with them in terms of trying to help people who are seeking help? So there's a lot of interesting research still to be done. I hope I've given you a flavor of how varied the ordinary voices in our head are, but also of how varied the more unusual experience of voice hearing is, showing you some of the connections between the two, and giving you some food for thought, I guess. This is the book, and this is it in its lovely US edition, which is coming up soon. And finally, a few acknowledgements. Thank you. People use inner speech for all sorts of emotional and motivational purposes. We talk to ourselves to gee ourselves up, to tell ourselves off, to encourage ourselves, and so on. So I think there's a whole range of different functions. I think inner speech has as many functions as ordinary language out loud does.